A father made a promise to his daughter, never fly again. But one night, high above the ocean, both pilots become sick. Now he must choose between keeping his promise and saving 189 people. Can he do both? Or will someone have to lose everything? Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Ethan Cole had stopped thinking of himself as a pilot 3 years ago. The uniforms were packed in a cedar chest in his closet, carefully preserved like artifacts from someone else's life. His Air Force ID had expired and gone into a drawer somewhere, he couldn't remember exactly where, which felt appropriate. Forgetting was part of the whole point. At 36, he looked like what he'd become, a software engineer in a faded hoodie, someone who spent his days debugging code instead of flying combat missions. The jeans he wore to the airport were worn soft at the knees from kneeling in his daughter's bedroom, checking under the bed for monsters. His running shoes had been scuffed by elementary school parking lots, not flight decks. He carried no flight jacket, no aviator sunglasses, no physical reminder of Captain Ethan "Fulkin" Cole, one of the Air Force's most decorated F-16 pilots, because that person didn't exist anymore. Or so he'd convinced himself. His carry-on held 3 things: a laptop for work, toiletries for a week of client meetings in New York, and a drawing his 7-year-old daughter Emma had made before he left Portland. She'd pressed it into his hands at breakfast, her small fingers trembling slightly. She didn't like when he traveled, even though he always came back. "For your trip, Daddy," she'd said. The drawing was crayon on construction paper, still slightly crumpled from being folded in his jacket pocket. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a rainbow, crude but unmistakably them. At the top, in letters that wavered and looped across the page like a child's earnest attempt at permanence, she'd written, "Daddy always comes home." He'd kissed the top of her head, smelled the strawberry shampoo Mrs. Kowalski had used to wash her hair, and promised he would. "I always do," he'd said. "Promise?" she'd asked, the way she always did, a ritual born from the day his wife had gone to preschool pickup and never come home. "Promise," he'd said, and meant it with everything he had. Now, in Seat 8A on Air Atlantic Flight 447, somewhere between New York and London at 35,000 feet, Ethan had the drawing folded in his lap while he tried to sleep. His head rested against the window, the darkness outside absolute, the kind of darkness you only find mid-ocean, midnight, where the curvature of the earth seems to swallow all light. To everyone around him, he was just another exhausted passenger on a red-eye, another tired face that belonged to the anonymous crowd of people who crossed the Atlantic for money or meetings or reasons that didn't matter much. The young man in 8B had headphones wedged in his ears, controller in his lap, eyes fixed on his phone with the glassy determination of someone playing the same game for the 100th hour. Somewhere nearby, someone was snoring. Overhead, someone else was coughing with the wet, hacking sound of someone trying unsuccessfully to sleep. The elderly woman in 8C, a Mrs. Patterson from her boarding pass, though they'd never formally introduced themselves, was reading something on her Kindle, occasionally glancing at him with the kind smile of someone who'd raised children of her own. "You look absolutely worn out," she'd said when boarding began, and he'd simply nodded, too tired to explain that exhaustion was his default state. It was what single parenthood looked like, good enough at work, excellent at being dad, and permanently depleted everywhere else. No one knew. No one could have known, looking at him, that this exhausted man in the hoodie had once been called Fulkin, short for fulcrum, because during a training exercise, he'd executed a maneuver so precise, so mathematically perfect, that it had become the pivot point for his entire squadron's victory. His instructors had said he flew like the aircraft was an extension of his own body, like the difference between him and the machine had simply ceased to exist. When he was in the cockpit, there was no learning curve, no hesitation. There was only flow, perfect, seamless, dangerous flow. He had 2,000 flight hours logged. 47 combat missions. The commendations and medals had names he could rattle off in his sleep, though he hadn't tried in years. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Meritorious Service Medal. They meant something once. They'd meant everything. But that was before Rebecca died. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in April, Ethan's wife had driven their 4-year-old daughter to preschool. Rebecca had been laughing about something Emma had said, one of those small parenting moments that nobody pays attention to until it's gone. They'd made it 4 blocks from home. The drunk driver had hit them at 7:47 in the morning, T-boning Rebecca's car at an intersection. Rebecca, who'd been driving since she was 16, who'd never gotten a speeding ticket, who'd spent her whole life being careful and good, Rebecca had died at the scene. Emma had survived. Concussion, broken collarbone, cuts. The doctors said she was lucky. The word lucky made Ethan want to scream, because luck was a lie they told people when fate had already done its worst. She wasn't lucky. She was orphaned by half, and the only thing keeping her from being a complete orphan was her father's presence in a cockpit 35,000 feet in the air, flying missions that had a real and quantifiable risk of killing him. He'd gotten the call while he was in a pre-flight briefing. Emma's voice, crying and confused, coming through Mrs. Chen's phone, "Daddy. Mommy won't wake up. Daddy, I want Mommy." He'd requested emergency leave before he hung up the phone. Caught a flight back to Portland that same afternoon. When he got to the hospital, Emma was asleep in a small bed, bandages white against her skin, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked against her chest. He'd sat beside her for hours, holding her small hand, and when she woke, he'd watched her little face try to understand that her mother wasn't coming back. "When is Mommy coming to get me?" she'd asked. He didn't know how to tell her. He still didn't know how to tell her 3 years later. The bereavement leave lasted a month. Then compassionate reassignment. Then, when he tried to return to duty, something had broken inside him that he couldn't repair by simply sitting in the cockpit and willing it to work. The F-16 was a beautiful machine, he'd loved it the way some people love other people, with an intensity that defied logical explanation. The stick felt right in his hand. The roar of the engines was the most honest sound he'd ever heard. Every system, every switch, every procedure was a language he spoke more fluently than English. But every time he strapped into the ejection seat, he saw Emma's face. Every single time. He'd be going through the pre-flight checklist, fuel quantity, landing gear, flight control surfaces, and suddenly there would be Emma at 4 years old, confused and small in a hospital bed, asking when her mother was coming home. He'd be accelerating down the runway, and he'd imagine the call she'd get one day, "I'm sorry to inform you that your father was killed in a training accident." He'd be at 35,000 feet, exactly where he was right now, except in his mind he was in an F-16 instead of a commercial airliner, and that was the moment the engine flamed out, or the hydraulics failed, or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong in a fighter jet finally did. The risk had always been there. He'd accepted it as part of the job, the cost of flying the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world. But that was when Rebecca was alive, when Emma had 2 parents, when there was redundancy in his daughter's life. That was before Emma had already lost one parent and Ethan refused, with a clarity that burned like a physical thing, to make her an orphan. He'd gone to his commanding officer and resigned his commission. The officer had tried to convince him to take more leave, to see someone, to give it time. "Foolkin, this is grief talking. You're one of the best pilots we have." "I know," Ethan had said. "That's why I have to get out now, while I can still fly." They'd given him a retirement ceremony. People had said things about his service, his skill, his bravery. He'd sat in dress uniform and felt like a ghost watching his own funeral. When it was over, he'd taken off the uniform, hung it in the cedar chest, and became someone else. The someone else got a job at a Portland tech company, boring and stable and grounded. He found a house in the suburbs, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a swing set, a school district that scored well on the websites that ranked such things. He hired Mrs. Kowalski, a retired woman who lived 2 blocks away and loved Emma like a granddaughter. He learned to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, which Emma preferred with strawberries and exactly 2 chocolate chips per pancake. He learned to braid her hair, though he'd never quite gotten it as neat as Rebecca had. He learned the names of her friends, attended her school events, helped her with reading and writing and the arithmetic that slowly made more sense as she got older. He became the kind of father who was present. Actually present, not the kind of father who was deployed half the year and came home tired from adrenaline crashes. Not the kind of father whose daughter had to understand that sometimes her father wouldn't come home at all. The night he told Emma he was leaving the Air Force, she'd sat on his bed in her pajamas, her face serious in a way no 5-year-old's face should be serious. "Will you still fly?" she'd asked. "No, sweetheart," he'd said, and he'd meant it absolutely. "I'm staying on the ground. With you. Promise?" She'd asked with such small, desperate hope that he'd felt his heart splinter. This was a child who'd learned that people you loved could disappear, who'd woken up in a hospital to the knowledge that her mother wasn't coming back. She needed to know that her father wasn't going to vanish the way her mother had. "I promise," he'd said. "I'm not going to fly anymore. Not ever." He'd pulled her close, and she'd wrapped her arms around his neck with the kind of fierce grip that said she understood, on some level, exactly what he was giving up. For 3 years, he'd kept that promise. He hadn't touched aircraft controls. Hadn't even looked at aviation websites or watched videos of planes taking off. When Emma drew pictures of airplanes, which she sometimes did, having grown up with a father who'd been a pilot, he'd smile and change the subject. Flying was his past. Emma was his present and his future. The choice had been simple, the kind of simple that only came from losing everything that mattered. Until tonight. The flight from New York had been uneventful in the way transatlantic red ice always are: boarding, the crush of people fitting themselves into narrow seats, the safety demonstration that nobody watches, the taxi from JFK that takes longer than the actual takeoff. Ethan had settled into 8A with his window seat and his exhaustion, pulled the thin airline blanket over himself, and fallen asleep before they reached cruising altitude. He'd dreamed about Emma. In the dream, she was 5 again, the age she'd been when he left the Air Force. They were at the Oregon coast, a trip they took every summer, and she was running toward the ocean with her arms spread like she was flying. He was chasing her, laughing, and even though he was running as fast as he could, she kept getting further away, getting smaller, disappearing into the fog. "Emma," he'd called. "Emma, come back." But she was already gone. The dream shifted, the way dreams do, no transition, just a sudden change of location. Now he was in the cockpit of an F-16, the stick cool in his hand, the HUD glowing before his eyes. The instruments were all exactly where they were supposed to be. His headset crackled with his call sign, "Fulkin, you're cleared hot." But when he looked at the multifunction display in front of him, instead of tactical information, there was Emma's face. She was asking him something, her voice distorted by the radio. "Daddy, are you coming home?" "Yes," he said, but the word came out wrong, electronically warped. "Emma, I'm always coming home. Promise?" He tried to answer, but the dream was already dissolving, fragmenting like a photograph burning at the edges. He woke suddenly, his heart rate elevated, to the sound of Captain Ross's voice. The captain's voice was wrong. Ethan's unconscious mind registered the wrongness before his waking mind could articulate it. There was strain in the tone, a carefully controlled panic underneath the professional cadence. Ross was trying to sound calm, succeeding at the technical level, but failing at every other one. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ross. We are experiencing a critical situation. I repeat, we are experiencing a critical situation. If there are any military pilots on board, particularly those with fighter experience and training in manual flight under extreme conditions, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. This is not a drill. If you have military flight training, you need to make yourself known now." The cabin erupted. Not in screaming, people weren't there yet, were probably still convinced this was some kind of drill or exaggeration. But in the sound of 189 people suddenly, collectively understanding that something was seriously wrong. Murmurs, gasps, the creak of seats as people twisted around to look at each other, the sound of a child asking, "Mommy, what's happening?" in a small, frightened voice. The young man in 8B yanked off his headphones. Did he just ask for military pilots? Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was already running through possibilities, assessing the situation with the kind of rapid calculation that had once been his job. Something catastrophic. Something that required expertise beyond what the standard crew possessed. Hydraulic failure, maybe. Instrument failure. Fire. Medical emergency that somehow involved both pilots being incapacitated. No, that didn't make sense unless they were already incapacitated, which meant the plane had been flying without proper crew input for at least a few minutes, which meant. A flight attendant appeared in the aisle, tall and professional, name tag reading, Bennett, moving through the cabin with the kind of forced composure that came from training designed to prevent panic. "Please remain seated," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her jaw. "If anyone has military flight experience, particularly any combat pilots or pilots trained in emergency manual procedures, please make yourself known. This is urgent." She moved down the row, scanning the faces of the passengers. Row 5, row 6, row 7. When she reached row 8, her eyes met Ethan's for a fraction of a second. Something flickered across her face, a question, a hesitation, but then she looked away and kept moving. What she saw was a tired man in a hoodie. A software engineer. A father who'd clearly been working too hard. Not a pilot. Not the kind of person who could fly a commercial airliner through a crisis. Ethan's mind was spinning now, spinning fast, running through calculations he'd sworn he was done making. Emma was home in Portland. Mrs. Kowalski would have put her to bed around 9, which meant she was asleep right now, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, her nightlight, the one shaped like a crescent moon, casting its soft glow across her bedroom. She was safe. She was warm. She was home. If this plane went down, she would wake up tomorrow morning, and Mrs. Kowalski would have to tell her that her father wasn't coming home after all. That the promise he'd made, "I'm not going to fly anymore, not ever," had been broken not by his choice but by circumstance. That he'd died doing exactly what he'd promised he wouldn't do. Ethan could see it with perfect clarity, the way trauma victims sometimes could, Emma at the kitchen table, her breakfast in front of her going cold. Emma's face when she understood. Emma crying, asking why, asking if it was her fault, asking every question that children ask when they lose someone and there's no answer good enough to make sense of the loss. But if he stayed silent, if he remained just another exhausted businessman trying to sleep on a transatlantic flight, then 189 people died. Emma lost her father anyway. Except this time, he'd had a choice. He saw the two options, clear and terrible and impossible. On one side, Emma waking up tomorrow in a world where her father was dead, but where he'd kept his promise. Where he'd been a man of his word, even if that word had been made in desperation and grief. On the other side, Emma waking up tomorrow in a world where her father was dead, but where he'd died trying to save other people. Where he'd broken his promise, but only because the alternative was letting nearly 200 people die. Which one would she forgive him for? Which one would he forgive himself for? Flight attendant Bennett was in the forward galley now, talking urgently into the radio. Ethan could hear her voice, barely audible over the ambient noise of the cabin. "We've inquired about military personnel. We don't have any responses yet." There was his answer. That was his signal. He could be the person who heard that call, recognized it for what it was, and stayed silent. Or he could be something else. Ethan stood. The movement wasn't dramatic or sudden. He simply unfastened his seatbelt, straightened up, and rose to his feet. But in the strange acoustics of a quiet cabin full of frightened people, it was enough to draw attention. Heads turned. The elderly woman in 8C looked up from her Kindle. The young man in 8B stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Flight attendant Bennett's eyes snapped toward him. "I was a fighter pilot," Ethan said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, quieter than he expected, steadier than he felt. F-16s. 12 years. 2,000 hours. Bennett's gaze swept over him, processing the contradiction between what she was seeing, worn hoodie, exhausted face, someone who looked like he barely had the energy to walk to the restroom, and what he was claiming. He could see the doubt flicker across her face like a light turning on and off. "You're saying you're military?" she asked. "I was," Ethan said. "Retired 3 years ago. I haven't carried my military ID since I got out. I'm just a software engineer now." He paused, then added quietly, "But I can fly. And I think you need someone who can." Before Bennett could respond, a man stood in row 9, broad-shouldered, gray hair, the unmistakable posture of someone who'd spent his life in uniform. "Former Army," he called out. "Did joint ops with Air Force pilots. I can verify him. It's Marcus Webb." Bennett nodded, and Marcus moved toward Ethan. The questions came rapid fire, but not hostile, the questions of someone who knew the language intimately enough to recognize a fraud immediately. "Squadron? 18th Fighting Squadron, Kadena. Call sign? Fulcan. Short for Fulcrum. Why'd you get that call sign?" Ethan found himself answering automatically, the memories surfacing like they'd never been buried at all. "Training exercise. We were running intercept drills, and I came off a high G turn into a barrel roll that positioned the entire squadron for a coordinated attack. My instructor said I was the fulcrum the whole squadron pivoted around. It stuck. Hydraulic failure emergency procedures, manual reversion mode. Engine out, switch to standby hydraulic system if available. If both systems are compromised, switch to manual reversion, use the mechanical linkages to flight control surfaces. Bank angle maximum 15 degrees. Airspeed critical. You've got limited pitch and roll control, need to be smooth on the inputs. Expect heavy stick pressure." Ethan had stopped looking at Marcus and was looking past him, looking through him, accessing the language of the air. Muscle memory. Not just physical memory, the hands knowing what to do, but psychological memory, the deep patterns of thinking that could only come from thousands of hours training for exactly this kind of situation. Marcus turned to Bennett. "He's legit. That's not Google knowledge. That's flight hour knowledge." Bennett's doubt shifted into something else, desperation, maybe, or the recognition that she was out of options. "Come with me," she said, and Ethan moved out of the row. As he passed the young man in 8B, the man said, "Good luck, man." Ethan nodded but didn't slow down. He was already somewhere else, already in the problem, already calculating, already becoming Fulcan again whether he wanted to or not. Bennett moved fast, leading him through the galley toward the cockpit. As they walked, she was talking. "Captain Ross experienced what we think is a stroke about 15 minutes ago. First Officer Miller is trying to maintain control, but he's only got about 800 hours and he's never handled a critical hydraulic failure. The autopilot came off automatically when the hydraulics started failing, and Miller doesn't have the experience to manually fly the aircraft with the compromised systems. 800 hours. Ethan had logged that in his training pipeline. 800 hours was still the beginning, you knew the basics, you could handle normal flight operations, but you'd never really been tested. You'd never had the stick in your hand during a true emergency, never felt what it was like when the machine stopped being docile and became something that wanted to kill you. They reached the cockpit door. Bennett punched in a code, and it opened. The first thing Ethan saw was Captain Ross slumped in the left seat, his face a concerning shade of gray. A man in a suit, Dr. Morrison, according to his name tag, was kneeling beside him, checking his pulse, his breathing, running through the assessment of someone trained in emergency medicine but completely out of their depth when it came to the aircraft situation. "Stroke," the doctor said, looking up at Bennett. "Massive one, by the look of it. He can't fly. He's barely conscious." First Officer Miller was in the right seat, white-knuckled on the yoke, flying the aircraft through pure determination and the kind of sustained anxiety that couldn't last much longer. His eyes were wide, fixed on the horizon, moving between the instrument panel and the windscreen with the jerky intensity of someone who'd been watching for the sign of a catastrophe he couldn't prevent. Ethan took in the full situation in a single, comprehensive glance. The instruments showed what Bennett had said: hydraulic pressure dropping in both systems, the autopilot offline, the aircraft in manual reversion, which meant Miller was flying this 767 using mechanical linkages that hadn't been designed for this role in 60 years. The pitch and roll indicators showed the aircraft was already developing issues: bank angle drifting slightly, airspeed beginning to wander lower than it should be. They had maybe 10 to 15 minutes before this got genuinely catastrophic. Miller was holding it together now through sheer willpower and the kind of focus that could only be sustained through an adrenaline rush. When the adrenaline wore off, and it would, as soon as his brain registered that something else was in control, he'd start making mistakes. "What's your airspeed?" Ethan asked, moving into the jump seat immediately behind and between the pilots. Miller's head snapped toward him for a fraction of a second. "Who the?" "Military pilot. Hydraulic emergencies. Tell me your airspeed." 280 knots, Miller said, answering the question automatically. "We need to be at 270 for stable descent, but my pitch control is sluggish and my bank angle's off. I keep trying to correct and it feels like I'm fighting the aircraft." Ethan could see it. Miller was over-controlling, making inputs that were too aggressive for a manually reversed 767. Every time he made a correction, the inertia of the aircraft was working against him, creating lag between input and response. He'd correct for that lag, then overcorrect, then correct again. It was a cycle that could spiral into loss of control very quickly. "Your fly-by-wire is completely offline?" Ethan asked. "Completely. System failure, not an override. The backup came up with faults." Ethan nodded. That explained the symptoms. Without fly-by-wire, without the computer assistance that modern aircraft relied on, Miller was literally trying to muscle a 300-ton aircraft through space using cables and mechanical linkages that had to be fought against at every input. It was like trying to steer a massive cargo ship with a single oar. "Bennett," Ethan said, still focused on the instruments, "what's your fuel situation?" "Enough to reach London." "Barely." Ethan shook his head. "You won't make it. You're burning too much fuel trying to maintain altitude and airspeed with these control issues. You need to divert." "Shannon Airport, Ireland." "How far?" Miller quickly checked the navigation display. 240 nautical miles. "That's doable. You've got the fuel." Ethan turned to Bennett. We need to notify dispatch, get permission for the divert, get Shannon prepared for an emergency landing. Tell them we're coming in with a dual hydraulic failure, both systems compromised, manual reversion only. We're going to need longest available runway, emergency equipment standing by." Bennett's hand shook slightly as she reached for the radio. "You're sure?" Ethan looked at Miller, exhausted, terrified, completely out of his depth. Looked at Captain Ross in the left seat, incapacitated, useless. Looked at the instrument panel that was going to kill everyone on this aircraft if someone didn't figure out how to fly it. He thought about Emma's drawing. "Daddy always comes home. I made a promise to my daughter," he said quietly, "that I'd never fly again. But if I don't fly now, I don't keep any promises. I don't get to come home." He looked at Bennett. "So yes. I'm sure." He turned to Miller. "I'm going to help you. You're going to stay on the controls, this is your aircraft and you're going to land it, but I'm going to talk you through every move. I've done this before. I know what we're looking for." Miller nodded, relief flooding his face so visibly that Ethan realized the man had been on the edge of complete panic, only the absolute necessity of keeping the aircraft in the air keeping him from breaking down. Ethan reached for the radio with his right hand, old muscle memory, automatic. His voice, when he keyed the transmitter, was steady: "Shannon Tower, Air Atlantic 447, declaring emergency. Dual hydraulic failure, loss of fly-by-wire systems, autopilot offline. Both pilots affected. We're coming in manual, diverting from London. Request longest available runway, emergency equipment standing by. There was a brief pause. Then Shannon Tower came back, professional and calm, Air Atlantic 447, Shannon Tower. We copy emergency. Runway 24 available, emergency equipment alerted and standing by. Descend to flight level 250, expect vectors for approach. Ethan nodded, even though they couldn't see him. Air Atlantic 447, descending to 250. He turned back to Miller. Okay. Gentle descent. You're going to reduce power gradually, and I want you to think about this not as the muscle movements you learned in training, but as pure intention. You intend to nose down. Your hands tell the aircraft what you intend. Gentle movements. The aircraft is going to respond with lag because of the hydraulic situation, so you're going to input, then wait, then assess. You're not fighting this machine. You're negotiating with it. Clear. Clear, Miller whispered. Let's go home, Ethan said. What happened next wasn't dramatic in the way thriller movies portrayed crises. There were no explosive moments, no dramatic failures, no sudden catastrophic turns. Instead, there was focus. Absolute, crystalline focus. For the next 40 minutes, Ethan became something other than what he promised to be. He became Fulcan. He coached Miller through every transition, power reduction, descent rate, bank angles, airspeed management. He taught him, in real time, how to think about flying a compromised aircraft, not as a series of mechanical inputs but as a conversation with the aircraft itself. The 767 was telling them things through the stick pressure, through the responsiveness of the control surfaces, through the subtle feedback of every system that was still working. Feel that? Ethan asked, when Miller started to drift left. That's the aircraft telling you it wants to roll. You have to say no, but gently. 1 degree correction. Let it settle. Good. Now hold. He ran calculations in his head with the kind of speed that came from having done exactly this kind of problem solving hundreds of times before. Fuel burn rates at current power setting and descent profile. Ground speed. Descent angle. Time to reach Shannon. Whether they had the fuel to circle for approach if needed, or whether they'd have to go straight in. All of it computed in the moment, all of it checked and rechecked. Bennett handled the radio communications with impressive calm, updating Shannon on their progress, working with dispatch to ensure the airport was fully prepared. Dr. Morrison moved Captain Ross to one of the crew rest areas, making the sick pilot as comfortable as possible, getting 4 fluids started. But the center of everything was the interaction between Ethan and Miller, between experience and desperation, between the two pilots flying this aircraft through the dark Atlantic. Miller's hands shook at first, fear, adrenaline, the weight of 189 lives depending on movements that were only barely within his control. But slowly, as Ethan talked him through each maneuver, something changed. The shaking subsided. His breathing became more regular. He started to trust not the aircraft but himself, with Ethan's guidance, to negotiate with the machine. You're doing good, Ethan told him. You're thinking about this right. Most pilots in an emergency try to overpower the aircraft. You're respecting it. That's why you're still in control. 20 minutes to Shannon. The descent was working. They were at the right altitude, the right airspeed, the right descent rate. The aircraft wasn't fighting them quite as hard. Systems were stabilizing. 15 minutes. Shannon Tower was vectoring them toward the approach. Ethan was coaching Miller through the approach setup, lowering the landing gear, extending the flaps incrementally, managing the power settings to keep everything balanced. The gear? Miller asked hesitantly. Lower it now. The hydraulic pressure is holding. Once we're in landing configuration, we probably won't have enough pressure to raise it again, but that's not what we're worried about. What are we worried about? Getting this thing on the ground, Ethan said simply. Everything else is secondary. 5 minutes. The runway lights were visible ahead, brilliant white lines in the darkness. Shannon had turned on every light they had. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac. The city itself seemed to be holding its breath. Ethan guided Miller through the final approach with the kind of quiet intensity that came from knowing exactly how fine the margin was. Bank angle. Descent rate. Airspeed. All of it had to be perfect. All of it had to be balanced. One mistake, one overcorrection, and this became a crash instead of a landing. You see the runway? Ethan asked. I see it. Then land on it. Miller touched down hard, harder than a trained landing, harder than the smooth contact of an aircraft operated by rested pilots with functioning autopilot systems. The wheels hit with a violent thump that made everyone in the jump seat hold their breath. But he held the aircraft straight. The nose gear came down. The braking systems, manual controlled now, since the hydraulics couldn't be trusted, engaged. The 767 decelerated, slowing, the runway passing beneath them in a blur of lights. They were still moving when Miller used a crosswind runway to angle them away from the main taxiway, bleeding off the last of their speed, coasting to a stop just shy of the emergency barriers at the end of the runway. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the cabin erupted. Applause, crying, the sound of nearly 200 people understanding, simultaneously, that they were alive. Miller's hands were shaking on the yoke. His face was wet. Ethan realized the man was crying, not with sadness but with the kind of relief that came from surviving something that should have killed you. You did good, Ethan said quietly. You kept your aircraft. You kept your people. You did the job. Miller nodded, unable to speak. Ethan sat in the jump seat, staring at nothing, his hands shaking now. The adrenaline was crashing. The focus was dissolving. He was becoming himself again, Ethan Cole, software engineer, single father, man who'd broken a promise to his daughter. Bennett was on the radio with ground control. Air Atlantic 447 is down and secure on runway 24. We need emergency medical services for a pilot with suspected stroke. Prepare to receive 189 passengers and crew. The aircraft came to a complete stop. Through the windows, Ethan could see the emergency vehicles converging, the flashing lights painting the cockpit in shades of red and blue. What's your name? Miller asked suddenly. I don't even know your name. Ethan Cole, Ethan said. But my pilots called me Fulkin. Miller nodded slowly. Thank you, Fulkin. Thank you for coming back. Ethan wondered if Miller understood how accurate that statement was. 6 hours later, after the evacuation had been completed, after the medical teams had seen to Captain Ross and pronounced him stable, after the FAA investigators had shown up and started asking questions, after the media had descended with cameras and breathless questions, Ethan sat in a quiet airline office at Shannon Airport with his phone in his hand. The time in Portland was 3:17 a.m. Emma would be asleep. Mrs. Kowalski, who stayed over on nights when Ethan traveled, would still be asleep too, most likely in the guest room, one ear always turned toward Emma's room the way mothers, and women who'd raised children, knew how to do. He needed to call. He needed to tell her before she heard it on the news. Ireland was almost 2 hours behind New York, which meant the story was already breaking. By the time Emma woke up, her school would be buzzing with the news. Mrs. Kowalski would have already seen the headlines. He found his number in his contacts and dialed. Mrs. Kowalski answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with fear. Ethan. Oh my God, Ethan, are you alive? I'm alive, he said. I'm safe. The aircraft made an emergency landing at Shannon. Everyone's okay. He could hear her breathing, the sound of her composing herself, pulling back from whatever adrenaline spike she'd been riding. Emma saw something on the morning news. She's asking for you. She's scared. Of course she was. She'd lost her mother to a random act of chance. The idea that her father would be in an emergency situation would activate every instinct she had for abandonment. Let me talk to her, Ethan said. There was a pause, the sound of movement, of Mrs. Kowalski walking to get his daughter. Then. Daddy? Emma's voice, small and worried, breaking in a way that made him understand exactly what he'd done. Hey, sweetheart. I'm okay. I'm safe. Everything's fine. The news said the plane had an emergency. The news lady said people got hurt. The news, she was starting to cry now, the words coming faster, more fragmented. The news said a daddy on the plane saved everyone. Were you that daddy? Daddy, did you save everyone? Ethan closed his eyes. He could see her exactly, 7 years old, standing in the kitchen in her school uniform, probably still holding Mrs. Kowalski's hand, scared and confused and trying to process something that didn't fit into the narrative she'd built for her life. Yeah, Em. That was me. But you promised you wouldn't fly anymore. Her voice wasn't angry. It was just statement of fact from a child who'd learned that the world wasn't safe, that things could change without warning, that promises made by people you loved couldn't always be kept. I know, Ethan said, and his own voice broke. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. Are you going to fly again? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. Ethan thought about the 189 people on that aircraft. He thought about First Officer Miller, who would now have a story he'd tell for the rest of his life. He thought about Captain Ross, who'd probably never fly again, whose career might be over from the stroke, but who would live because Ethan had been on that flight. He thought about Emma, and what she'd lost, and how much more she could lose. No, Em. I'm not going to fly again. But I had to fly one more time because people needed help, and I was the only one who could give it. And that was the right thing to do, even though I broke my promise to you. Sometimes, he paused, trying to find words that a 7-year-old could understand, that didn't minimize her fear but acknowledged the complexity of the choice he'd made. Sometimes keeping one promise means breaking another. And I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. But I had to save those people. And I'm coming home. I'm coming home to you, and I'm staying home. Promise? She asked it the same way she always did, with the desperate hope that this time, he could make a promise that wouldn't be broken. Promise, Ethan said, and meant it with everything he had. I promise. He could hear her breathing change, the fear subsiding slightly into something more manageable. The news lady said you were very brave. I wasn't brave, Ethan said. I was scared. I was terrified. But I knew what had to be done, so I did it. That's what you do when people need you. You do the thing that has to be done. Okay, Emma said quietly. When are you coming home? Tomorrow, Ethan said. There are investigators who need to talk to me, but I'll be on a flight tomorrow and I'll be home by evening. Promise? He laughed, a sound that was part sob. Promise. Let me talk to Mrs. Kowalski again. There was the sound of the phone changing hands. Mrs. Kowalski's voice came back, she's going to be okay. Kids are resilient. But she's going to need you. I know, Ethan said. I'll be home tomorrow. Thank you for being there. Thank you for keeping her safe. That's what I do, Mrs. Kowalski said simply. When he hung up the phone, Ethan sat in the quiet office at Shannon Airport and let himself fall apart, just a little, just enough to release the pressure that had been building for 6 hours. Then he pulled himself together, straightened his clothes, and went to find the FAA investigators who wanted to understand, in technical detail, exactly how a software engineer who'd been retired from the Air Force for 3 years had somehow remembered how to fly an aircraft in critical condition. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in Portland, Ethan stood in his backyard while Emma played on her swing set. The summer sun was warm, the kind of day that made you believe the world could be good, could be safe, could be predictable. His phone rang. He recognized the number, Air Force Reserves, Office of Personnel Management. He looked at Emma, swinging higher, laughing, completely absorbed in the moment. Then he answered. Captain Cole, the voice on the other end said, a woman, professional, efficient. This is Commander Sarah Mitchell with the Air Force Reserve. We've been following the situation with Air Atlantic Flight 447. The Air Force would like to offer you a position. Ethan's stomach tightened. I'm not interested in flying again. This isn't a flying position, Commander Mitchell said. We want you to train emergency response pilots in high-stress aviation situations. Advanced emergency procedures, manual reversion protocols, decision-making under catastrophic failure. Your background, combined with what happened on Flight 447, makes you uniquely qualified to prepare the next generation for crises. It's part-time, minimal travel, probably 2 days a week at most. You'd be based in Portland, working at the Northwest Reserve Facility. Ethan was quiet for a moment. It wasn't asking him to fly. It was asking him to teach others to survive the things he'd survived. It was asking him to take the skills and knowledge he'd almost lost and pass them on to other pilots so they could save lives the way he'd saved lives. Can I get back to you? He asked. Of course. Take your time. This is a significant decision. When he hung up, Emma had gotten off the swing and was walking over to him, that particular gait she had that was still slightly little girl but showing hints of who she'd become. Is it about flying? She asked, with the kind of perceptiveness that children developed when they'd experienced loss. Yeah. Are you going to say yes? Ethan knelt down to her level, so they were eye to eye. I don't know. What do you think? Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering with the seriousness that 7-year-olds managed when they were thinking about something important. I think, she said slowly, I think you should help people. Like you helped those people on the plane. But you have to come home every night. Every night? Ethan asked. Every night, Emma confirmed. And you have to have dinner with me, and you have to help me with my homework, and you have to tuck me in and check under the bed for monsters. Every single night? Every single night, Emma said firmly. Then her expression softened slightly. I'm proud of you, Daddy. You're brave. Ethan pulled her into a hug, breathing in the smell of her hair, strawberry shampoo, sunshine, childhood. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he realized that somewhere in the past 3 months, she'd worked through the fear. She'd processed the broken promise and come out the other side understanding that her father was someone who did the right thing, even when it cost him something. Okay, he said. Then we'll say yes. He called Commander Mitchell back that evening and accepted the position. He'd start in 2 weeks, after a final evaluation and briefing process. 2 days a week, mostly confined to Portland. Enough to let him pass on what he knew. Not enough to derail his life with Emma, not enough to break the promise he'd made in a different form. That night, as he tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question he'd been expecting, does this mean you're going to be a pilot again? Not really, Ethan said. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to teach other pilots how to do what I did on the plane, so they can help people. But you won't fly. I won't fly, Ethan promised. I'll stay on the ground with you. Emma nodded, satisfied. Okay. That's okay then. 6 months later, Ethan was in a briefing room at the Northwest Air Force Reserve Facility, teaching a class of emergency response pilots about manual aircraft control in catastrophic failure situations. He was drawing diagrams on the whiteboard, hydraulic systems, flight control linkages, the way an aircraft's natural stability could be your friend or your enemy depending on how you flew. The thing nobody tells you in training, he said to the class of 8 pilots, all of them sharp, all of them terrified and excited to be learning from someone who'd done it for real, is that flying isn't about muscle memory. Muscle memory is just the beginning. Real flying, flying that saves lives, is about understanding the conversation between you and the machine. The aircraft is constantly telling you things. It's your job to listen. One of the pilots, a young captain named Sarah Chen, raised her hand. Captain Cole, on Flight 447, at what point did you know you were going to take the controls? Ethan considered the question. I knew, he said slowly, about 3 seconds before I stood up. I was asleep, and when I heard the captain's call, I immediately understood the scope of the problem. My brain started running calculations: what could cause this situation, what resources were available, what was the likely outcome if we did nothing. And once I understood those things, I understood that I was probably the only person on that aircraft with the specific training to handle it. That must have been a hell of a decision, Sarah said. It wasn't a decision, Ethan replied. That's the thing people don't understand about moments like that. It wasn't a choice I made. By the time my conscious mind caught up, my unconscious mind had already committed. The choice had been made by the person I used to be, the pilot I tried so hard to stop being. And maybe that's the real truth about keeping promises. Sometimes the deepest promise you make is not the one you say out loud. It's the one you live out every single day. He looked at the class. My daughter made me promise to never fly again. I broke that promise. But I kept a deeper one, the promise to always be there for her, even when being there means doing things that seem to contradict what we've said we'd do. Some promises, the really important ones, require us to occasionally break other promises just to keep the spirit of them alive. Sarah was scribbling notes. Is that something they taught you in the Air Force? No, Ethan said. That's something I learned from a 7-year-old who had the wisdom to understand that a promise made in fear isn't the same as a promise made in love. That evening, Ethan drove home to Portland. Traffic was light, and he made good time. Mrs. Kowalski had left Emma at home with a babysitter, a college student she trusted, but Emma was waiting at the window when Ethan pulled into the driveway. She ran out to meet him, slamming into his legs in the way she had when she was excited, wrapping her arms around him. He picked her up. She was getting heavier, getting older, already showing signs of the person she'd become, and carried her back inside. They made their usual Saturday dinner together, pasta with marinara sauce, which Emma preferred to more complicated meals. They talked about her school, about the new friends she'd made, about the book she was reading for class. Normal things. Regular things. The kind of things that made life worth saving. After dinner, as he was tucking her into bed, Emma asked, "Did you teach the pilots today?" "Yeah, I did." "Did they listen?" "They listened really well." "Good," Emma said. "You're a good teacher, Daddy. You taught me the most important thing." "What's that?" Ethan asked, though he thought he knew. "That it's okay to break a promise if you have to," Emma said. "As long as you keep the more important one." Ethan kissed her forehead, and in that moment, understood something fundamental: he hadn't just saved lives on Flight 447. He'd taught his daughter, without intending to, that the world was more complex than a simple promise or a simple breaking of it. That sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the cost of your choices. That heroism wasn't about perfection, it was about being willing to be imperfect in service of something that mattered. When Fulkin hung up his flight suit 3 years ago, something had died. The fighter pilot, the man defined by his call sign and his combat hours and his records, he'd put that away. But something else had been born. Something better. A man who could fly, but chose not to accept when the cost of staying on the ground was the lives of people he'd never meet. A father who understood that the most important flying happened in the heart, not in the sky. The promise he'd made to Emma hadn't been broken on Flight 447. It had been kept in the only way that mattered, by loving her enough to do the impossible, enough to face his greatest fears, enough to become more than he thought he could be. And every single night, he came home. He checked under the bed for monsters. He helped with homework. He tucked her in and kissed her forehead. He kept the promise that had always mattered most, the promise to be there. Some promises, he'd learned, are written in words. Some are written in the way a father shows up every single day for the child who lost her mother. Some are written in the decision to walk away from a career you loved because loving someone else more mattered infinitely more. And some promises are kept by occasionally breaking them, by being willing to risk everything when the only alternative is losing the people who needed you most. Fulton had flown one more time. But Ethan Cole, software engineer, teacher, single father, that was the man who truly understood how to navigate through the storm and find his way home.